And I'm really honored to be able to present today. And I'm especially glad to speak to fellow colleagues who work extensively in rural systems and in fisheries. As you may know, coastal and marine and island systems are also the focus area of Dakshin, which is my own organization. So I'm really happy to be here. So I have to start with a confession by saying that I'm not primarily a gender researcher. And even though it's an axis of paramount importance, I'm actually guilty of not looking at it at gender critically enough due to a focus on other themes and priorities and so on. And secondly, even when my work has focused on gendered practices, as in the case of my work on hunting, I've looked a lot at male hunting and male strategies. But what I wanted to say is that even when you're not looking specifically at gender, you can't really wish it away. It's a critical and often distinguishing variable that separates or explains various aspects of human behavior, practices, outcomes, and so on. And the same applies to human-wildlife relations. So what I'd like to do for the next few minutes is to talk about how gender plays out in three interrelated fields that I work with currently. That is in wildlife conservation, in the hunting, harvesting, and use of wildlife, and finally in the emerging field of human-wildlife conflict and coexistence. Some of the themes that I focus on today will also deal with male strategies and performative masculinity, as they provide a valuable contrast to that of women in these explorations. And although I won't go into very deep into any particular field due to constraints on time, I would like to pay attention to a few gender dimensions within each of the themes. I'll look at a few global examples. While looking at conservationists and scientists, I'll briefly examine how little women figure in conservation disciplines, and I'll also look a little bit at celebrity conservation. But I would like to focus again on the contribution of women from traditional societies and their practices and their role in contemporary wildlife conservation. For the second expression, I would like to take a brief look at where women are placed in the hunting and sustainable use spectrum by focusing on the long-standing man-the-hunter debate. And finally, I'd like to look at gendered patterns and relationships with respect to species that are involved in conflict. And this is informed by my own work in environmental history and anthropology, as well as recent contemporary perspectives from feminist political ecology. But before that, I wanted to highlight some recent research which has taken place at a very broad, looking at very broad scale differences in gender relations in human-animal relations as a whole, not just with wildlife, but animals as a whole. There is a recent paper by Hal Herzog, who's a psychologist, who's shown that indeed there are gender differences in attitudes towards the treatment of animals in terms of attachments to pets, involvement in animal protectionism, animal hoarding, hunting, animal abuse, bestiality, and so on. He puts forward the claim that on average, women show higher levels of positive behaviors and attitudes towards animals. That is, according to him, these are, like a reluctance to use animals, more involvement in animal protection, and so on. Whereas men typically have higher levels of negative attitudes and behaviors. That is, either they're involved in hunting or there might be more cases of animal abuse by men and less favorable attitudes to animal protection. I'm not really thrilled with the way he labels some of these behaviors as positive and negative. I think there's a lot of bias there, but nevertheless, there are differences in most of these areas. But he also points out that in most of these areas, there is also considerable overlap between men and women, with much greater within sex variation than between sex variation. And we'll talk about that maybe a little later. Coming to the role of women in conservation, usually when we are taught about the origins of modern conservation and conservationists and the pioneering conservationists, we are typically flooded with the names of men who are associated with the North American romantic conservation movement. These are very influential individuals like Henry David Thoreau, John Muir, Ansel Adams, and even people like Aldo Leopold and Theodore Roosevelt and so on, who were not diehard protectionists, but nevertheless had a significant influence as to where the discipline was, where conservation was moving. It's only somewhat much later, actually, that we come across names such as that of Rachel Carson. She was an aquatic biologist who actually showed environmental effect of pesticides such as DDT and so on amphibians and so on. And she was also the author of the landmark publication Silent Spring. So what is being said is that the influence of some of these early and predominantly male conservationists, combined with existing colonial practices such as those of the removal of indigenous people from their lands, was instrumental in the development of a very strong exclusionary fortress conservation model, which was exported widely across the world and has come to be the norm even in places like India. And recently, researchers have even suggested that the intertwining of patriarchy with capitalism, colonialism, and militarism ensures that the benefits of power and privilege flow primarily to men. And feminists have pointed out that patriarchy privileges certain types of masculinity, that is through the erasure of emotional connection, suppression of empathy, by promoting detachment and prime men for violence. The claim is that patriarchy normalizes the objectification and the instrumentalization of nature, and thereby facilitating exploitation and destruction. And also that violence against human minority groups and animals are actually, are violent male practices. I do not share this particular viewpoint at all. While I agree that male domination and the dominance in conservation has been a long-standing pattern, and that there have been a range of problematic outcomes, attributing all the ills of conservation to patriarchy is somewhat unnuanced. And as I said before, some of these studies also easily see long-term practices such as animal use and hunting as simply black and white. These type of assumptions also naively assume that they attribute an absolute lack of agency to women, whereas in reality, women are not passive spectators, but are active participants. But needless to say, over the years, there have been a number of influential women in conservation. Whether we are talking about individuals like Joy Adamson, who was an artist and a writer, and who went on to influence millions through her writing and subsequently the films. We have controversial celebrities like Brigitte Bardot, who in the 1970s lobbied against the harp seal commercial harvests by indigenous groups. It's been an ongoing battle between animal rights groups and others, including these guys who served a burger made out of seal meat and called it the Bardot burger. And she, of course, retaliated in an equally immature fashion by showing a human baby that has been clubbed to death by a harp seal, just illustrating that sometimes, women celebrities are sometimes drawn towards more animal rights positions. And then there are, like Rachel Carson, there have been researchers like Jane Goodall who studied chimpanzees for a long period of time, and more importantly, showed us that chimps and people are not so different after all. And primatology and primate conservation is an especially interesting detour here, because unlike a number of other conservation and scientific disciplines, there have been a number of very prominent women in this field. In fact, primatology has been called an equal opportunity discipline, alluding to the fact that it has almost 50% female representation, which is a lot compared to other science disciplines. And it's even been called a feminist science. And here in this photograph, you have the triumvirate of primatology, the late Diane Fossey, Jane Goodall, and Birute Galdikas, who worked on gorillas, chimpanzees, and orangutans, respectively. So why are there so many women in this field? Do women make better primatologists? And quite a few reasons have been put forward. And first, and perhaps the most superficial one, is that women are perhaps picking cute and cuddly animals. But in fact, if you look at primates in some detail, we find that while they do look cute on the outside, just like humans, there's no dearth of violence among them. Many primates kill, rape, commit infanticide, and consume other animals. In fact, chimpanzees are even known to predate on infant humans. Another reason is that biology, psychology, and anthropology, the three parent disciplines of primatology, have considerably large numbers of women. And this might be the fact that primatology has so many women is a function of that as well. The other reason is that primatology is probably a young discipline, and which is not beset by patriarchal hierarchies, and attract a lot of women into the field. Others have attributed this to the Leakey effect. If you remember Dr. Louis Leakey, the Kenyan British paleoanthropologist and archaeologist, he mentored these three women, and who in turn influenced further participation. There was a lot of coverage by National Geographic and other magazines about their work, and invited more women to join this group. There are also explanations that deal with the fact that among primates, there's a preponderance of female-bonded primate societies, where females stay in the same group. And the fact that primate behavior might be giving insights into human behavior, and that women are more likely to take on disciplines that offer scope for, in interior change and improvement and so on, and are less likely to choose disciplines such as math, physics and chemistry and engineering, which deal with more hard abstractions. These are the viewpoints that have been put forward. The Indian conservation situation roughly follows the global one as far as gender representation is concerned. There have been a lot of alpha males and must bulls, as one of my colleagues put it, and a clear pattern of male researchers fishing down the food chain, fighting over lions, tigers, elephants, and so on, before moving on to smaller, less charismatic species. Most disciplines in conservation are still highly male-dominated, some more than the others. For instance, using the example of herpetology, that is the study of reptiles and amphibians, a recent evaluation of over 1,000 publications I think the last 70 years, shows a very strong male bias. About 70% of the papers only had male co-authors. At the same time, although only few, Indian herpetology has been lucky to have some women, intrepid women herpetologists who've contributed immensely to conservation in the country. And I'm sure for most of you who are sitting in Chennai, this is not new. You'll be familiar with this person, Zai Whitaker, who, along with Romulus Whitaker, founded the Madras Crocodile Bank. And it was Zai's surveys in the Andaman Islands, which were the precursor to a lot of field work and exploration in the islands, and also the establishment of field stations like the Andaman Nicobar Environment Team. Further, her work has been instrumental in imparting the joy of herping to young readers across the world. And when talking about women in reptile conservation in India, one name again stands out. That is of J. Vijaya, or Viji as she was known. She was instrumental in the rediscovery of the forest cane turtle, which was a rare species of turtle of which only 2 specimens had ever been described, had ever been recorded, and which had been missing from the records for over 70 years. So working with the tribal elder, Vijay spent extended amounts of time in the Nadgani forest and rediscovered the species, started a captive breeding program at the Croc Bank. And not only that, her dedication towards chelonians took her across different parts of the country that were not particularly safe for anyone, such as the Chambal ravines and so on. And in the early 1980s, she also published an article with photographs on the mass slaughter of olive ridleys in Digha, where these turtles were meant for the Calcutta meat markets. And it's believed to have motivated Mrs. Indira Gandhi, who was the prime minister then, to call for urgent action for protection. But moving away from the glitzy side of conservation, while a lot is talked about conservationists and their relationships with wildlife or how they came about, we seldom pay attention to the gendered roles within communities that bring about positive conservation outcomes, that is within traditional communities. And a key axis of difference between indigenous conservationist relationships to land and the others is that of use of species and ecosystems. In many traditional societies, local communities, especially women, have been instrumental in the manipulation of the landscape and in the maintenance of often a richer level of biodiversity than otherwise would have been. And this has been shown to be true of several native landscapes. In North America, we have the work of William Cronon for New England and Kat Anderson, who documents this extensively for California. These are important contributions. Both point out that the abundance of game that was witnessed by the white settlers on their arrival was not a result of a pristine, untouched landscape, as was assumed, but the product of Native American manipulation of land. A very good contemporary illustration for this is the Australian context. So anthropologists Rebecca and Douglas Bird, who conduct a lot of the research on the Martu people in Western Australia, have shown that the women traditionally have this practice of setting small fires while foraging and hunting for different species, bustard, emus, kangaroo, and also the age-old practice of goanna hunting. Goannas are species of varanus, like our monitor lizard. And this practice results in a patchwork of landscape, in a patchwork kind of landscape that provides a perfect environment for threatened species like bilbies, wallabies, possums, and so on. But when this type of controlled burning was stopped, as it was many years ago, what happened was that the fuel load in terms of Spinifex grass in these areas built up so much that if there was a lightning strike, very large patches of land were devastated. And so the Martu were cleared off their lands in the 1960s for some missile tests and so on. And until they won their territory back in the early 2000s, controlled burning was not carried out. And when they regained their title, the fire regime was rejuvenated again. And their practices protect the region from the devastating fires which used to happen. So as we know, knowledge about country, knowledge about fire, and knowledge about animals are part of the unique aboriginal cosmology of the dreaming, or the dream time, as it's called. And women are stewards of several streams of these forms of knowledge, practice, and performance. In marine systems also, similarly, women play a significant role. In one of my own organization's field sites, the Lakshadweep Islands, our sustainable fisheries team has documented and has been working with Appal Kuttal or the traditional octopus fishery, which is carried out by women and children during the reefs, on the reefs during the low tide. It's a gleaning practice. Octopus are selectively harvested. The harvesters can ensure that females or juveniles are not harvested before breeding. Harvesting can be done without impacting reef health in any adverse fashion, and so on. And since the octopus is a fast-growing species, it's a relatively simple and effective renewable fishery which can be easily regulated. A related question that researchers such as us who work with local communities who sustainably utilize wildlife are often asked is, how can we support this kind of exploitation of wildlife? And I think the broader question to be asked here is, does the use of wildlife as an edible resource or for other purposes, does it impact conservation negatively in terms of the levels of biodiversity? And does that also negate positive bonds between people and wildlife? The answer to the first is already evident. As we saw before, indigenous land use and relationship with species has the potential to be sustainable if carried out right. And sometimes this can lead to better biodiversity outcomes. For the second, I will provide two gendered examples. So the first is that in parts of Amazonia, it's a common sight to see indigenous community members, especially women and young girls, carrying different species of monkeys, often on their shoulders or on their head. Usually this bond arises when the mother is hunted, leaving behind an orphaned baby. And the baby is often kept as a pet, and it is integrated with the family. Especially its new parent, who is likely to be a young girl or a woman. And Charlie Hamilton Jones, the National Geographic photographer who took these images, writes about this unique bond. And he says that despite the brutal start, the love and bond between people and their monkeys represents this deep relationship between indigenous people of the Amazon and their natural world. The second example relates to a community of ethnic Kazakhs settled in the Altai Mountains in Mongolia. They hunt using eagles. So female eagles, that is female golden eagles, and females make better hunters. They're taken from their nests, from their eyries when they're very small, and looked after by the hunters and trained, and a bond develops between the hunter and the eagle. And the eagles are used to hunt small prey, which are used for meat and fur. And these birds become an integral part of their families. It's believed that the Burkichi, or the hunters, in fact, prefer them to their wives. And for some of them, it's a very intense bond. And what's even more surprising is that after several years, the birds are released back into the wild again, and they seem to survive well on their own, because sometimes when the hunters are out again, they meet these birds again, and the eagles come to them. And only with about 50 or 60 such eagle hunters left, this seems to be a generation of, be almost the last generation of hunters, because most of the children are leaving for easier work in the cities, and hardly anyone wants to take this up. So this is a unique cultural practice that seems to be dying out in the wake of modernity. And more often than not, cultural practices such as this are viewed by urban conservationists as problematic and are criticized endlessly, either for taking young birds out of their nests, or more often the criticism is against the use of free-ranging wild species, or how humans are benefiting from such violence. There are accusations of disrespect to animal and so on. And it is an ongoing debate. The community, of course, swears by their love for the eagles and defend their ways of life. So when conservationists look at the different roles for wild species in relation to humans, we tend to look at this in black and white, between protection and destruction or exploitation, without looking at the middle ground and the case for multifaceted engagements, which can be separated along different axes, including sex and gender. And One of the controversial dimensions in that is, as I said, of hunting. A lot of my own work is on this topic, with a very, very long history that predates modern humans. Hunting is believed to have catalyzed human evolution through nutritional and provisioning benefits. It takes a range of forms, and in some of these, there are very distinct. There are distinct gender differences. For instance, on average, though there are exceptions, men hunt bigger game, women hunt smaller animals, and do a lot of the foraging. In its most simplistic and naive form, this idea fueled the man the hunter debate in the late 1960s, in which male contributions to provisioning and masculine coded activities were considered central to human development. And stereotypically, these were exalted. At the same time, women's contributions as well as their agency were devalued. But this initial debate does a favor by triggering a huge range of explorations, which are really interesting from the perspective in the hunting of wildlife. And a key contribution here is the work of Kristen Hawkes, who's an anthropologist who has extensively studied the Hadza tribe in Tanzania. What she found was that while men did indeed spend a lot of time hunting, but were successful only a very small percentage of the time. Success rates of individual men were really low, a little over 3%. On the other hand, both women who were both young and old were responsible for securing the majority of calories for their families. This could be through hunting small game, digging up tubers, grubs, collecting honey, and so on. Basically, everyday foraging practices that were less uncertain than big game hunting and more productive for the family. Hawkes also found another interesting thing. Once a woman had a second child, the amount of food that the grandmothers were collecting, not the mothers, the grandmothers were collecting, correlated to the well-being of the children. And so she then links this research to the grandmother hypothesis, which posits that the long menopausal stage in human females is an adaptation that is beneficial for long-term fitness. And the grandmother's contribution could be through providing food, contributing to childcare, through imparting knowledge, and so on. And we find that in many traditional societies as well as in modern ones, grandmothers play a key role. My own work shows that the general pattern of big game hunting by males still dominates. There's evidence for this right from the time of early hominids to anatomically modern humans and also contemporary communities, especially those who have made the transition from hunting and gathering to foraging to pastoralism, agriculture, and a range of modern occupations. And we view this form of hunting as a costly signaling strategy that could signal intrinsic quality to potential mates or competitors, or you could call it a hunting handicap or an arena for showing off in order to secure dominance, status, and prestige. And this was initially suggested by Professor Kristen Hawkes. This, however, doesn't mean that women don't or can't hunt. There are groups like the ACTA in the Philippines, the Simane in the Bolivian Amazon, and a number of others who take part in hunting while still more than adequately fulfilling their roles as mothers and caregivers. ACTA women are known to hunt pigs and deer using bow and arrows. The work by researchers like Madeline Goodman and Vicky Reyes Garcia and all show that the dichotomy between men and women hunting and between male and female roles is not as great as previously assumed. That is among forager communities. But the difference is that women often hunt using strategies that maximize for success in different ways than men. For instance, women are known to carry out less solo hunting, preferring instead to go in groups. They prefer hunting using dogs and so on. And the emergence of, say, handheld tools such as the atlatl, which is shown here, it's a spear thrower, and it's been known to equalize the velocity of male and female launched objects. These kind of discoveries mean that women could have taken part more in big game hunting in prehistoric times. So there's more and more evidence which is being gathered to show that big game hunting among foragers saw broader participation from both females and males. So the attribution of deep history to a gender division of labor is quite a hotly contested topic now. And at this point, there are also a group of anthropologists who are increasingly trying, and I feel trying too hard to support the woman, the hunter argument. They use not only the case of early foragers, but also point out that there have been women warriors like the Dahomey Amazons who are shown here, who are very skilled in the use of edged weapons and skilled in hand-to-hand combat and so on. But others point out that women have been known to hunt and take part actively in war, but this is an exception rather than the rule. And when it comes to animals involved in conflict with people, however, it has been hunting by males that has really dominated. And often the destruction of so-called dangerous beasts and vermin was turned into a sporting activity, be it tiger hunts or elephant hunts, or pig sticking, which was a practice which was carried out in parts of northern India and so on. In the Indian subcontinent, during the colonial period, this form of engagement was extremely popular. Shikar was a pastime as well as a means of upward mobility for subaltern British officers. The prevailing belief was that hunters made good soldiers. The historian Karen Jones reminds us that hunting was a highly performative activity. Not only was masculinity played out in the field, so-called ridding the colonies of dangerous game and passing on subtle messages of dominance to native populations, the hunt was performed again through the export of trophies back to places like England, and also through the publication of Victorian hunting memoirs and so on. But unlike the colonial period and its obsession with dangerous game, in contemporary forms of conflict, there are also a range of patterns that can be separated along the lines of gender. Depending on the context, different stakeholder groups are at the receiving end of animal attacks and so on. Women, men, adolescents, children all have different risk profiles. And there are different gender differences in how conflict or coexistence is perceived, experienced, and even reconciled with. And the differences maybe also in terms of exposure and sexual division of labor. For instance, in my study area in the Andamans, most of the crocodile attack victims are males, because the men are the ones who go out fishing in the creeks and out in these in crocodile habitats. The same also applies to a large extent to elephant conflict. But if you look at a situation like in the Garhwal Himalaya, more women get attacked by the Himalayan black bears, which are found there in larger numbers. In fact, much of it is because women are the ones who are going out and gathering fodder and fuel wood, and and as a result, they get attacked. And patriarchy has a big role to play in this. Radhika Govindrajan, in her book Animal Intimacies, actually talks about the whole human-bear relations in a very interesting fashion, if you wanted to follow up on that. And women often perceive a greater risk from wildlife. If attacked, children and women have lower chances of survival in attacks by large animals and also by venomous species. There's a strong relation with body mass and survival. In attacks such as with species like bears, leopards, crocodiles, and so on, there's a lot of physical injuries. There's lacerations, soft tissue damage, disfigurement, amputations, and so on. And animal attacks are again life-changing, not just because from the perspective of physical injury alone, but also in terms of PTSD and mental health related struggles. Conflict with wildlife, therefore, entails a number of hidden costs for marginalized groups that are lower in the social hierarchies, especially women. And I would like to illustrate this with two examples from that of India itself. One is tigers in the Sundarbans and elephants in Assam. So, Bagh Vidhva or tiger widows are widows of women, of men who have been killed by tigers in the Sundarban. In most cases, the men went out into the forest to catch fish or catch crabs or harvest honey and so on, and fell victim to tigers. In 2016 alone, an enumeration of which was carried out suggested that there were at least 3,000 such widows in the Sundarbans. And these women are considered by the families of men as well as the community as a whole as unholy or as ill omens. And in many cases, the in-laws end up blaming them for the death of their sons. This is in part reinforced by the Bon Bibi legend. As you may know, in this part of the world, Bon Bibi is considered the primary protector of the people and activities that are carried out in the forest. And the displeasure of Bon Bibi can be incurred in the form of attacks. And I'm describing this in a very simplistic manner. There's a wider and much more nuanced debate around it. But as far as the widows are concerned, it plays out to be a very unfortunate situation. And Arabinda Chowdhury, who is the lead author on one of the papers on this particular issue, reports that there are two layers of stigma. The first relates to the sense of guilt, which is suffered by the widows themselves and by the psychological trauma associated with it. And the second, as this hand-drawn map indicates, tiger widows are often considered cursed. They're ostracized from society and expected to live in isolation from the rest of the community. So in a society where widows already have a low social standing and uncertain livelihood opportunities, the stigma associated with their husbands being killed by tigers is even more, and widowhood impacts all aspects of life. And my own work in Kerala on elephants also shows some of these patterns, that women are often at the receiving end of some of these kind of conflicts. This particular example, however, is from Assam. And a recent piece of work that illustrates this well is the exploration of human-elephant relations by Sayan Banerjee and Shalini Sharma. They use the analytical framework of feminist political ecology to explore and highlight the gendered vulnerabilities and impacts, how living with elephants can result in gendered knowledge about elephants, and how conservation interventions, especially the decolonized ones, can maybe respond better to some of these gender dimensions. And talking about gendered risks and vulnerabilities, they point out that there are spatial, temporal, and seasonal differences in the way men and women engage with elephant habitats. For instance, women interact more with elephants when they're collecting fodder, firewood, or water from forest areas, and also during the sowing period, since sowing is done by women, as opposed to men who come under attack from elephants largely while guarding crops at night or moving through the landscape at night. And restricted mobility and similar impacts also yield a lot of gendered responses. For instance, the presence of elephants in tea estates leads to disruption of work. The outmigration of men in these landscapes for better livelihoods makes some of the families as de facto women-headed, and women are saddled with the additional responsibility of having to continue working despite the presence of elephants. And there are several mental health impacts due to fear and chronic stress associated with elephant presence. But these interactions also translate to different forms of gendered knowledge and ways of coping. Banerjee and Sharma also observed that high levels of conflict are there, but elephants are still revered by women who seem to respect and empathize with the elephants, considering their mutual deprivation and lack of food. At the same time, this is also embroiled in further anxiety and alcoholism and all for men. The authors also found that despite gendered risks, vulnerabilities, impacts, and coping mechanisms, the conflict management responses remain predominantly masculine or male oriented, such as driving elephants out of the fields or migrating out of the system. The authors also say that despite these dimensions, conservation responses are often one-sided. There's a need for place-based responses and a need to foreground gendered voices in both research and practice. And women need to be part of the decision-making bodies for conflict resolution and in formulating responses, especially in relation to their lives and livelihoods. So just to summarize, in the previous few slides, we looked at various ways in which gender is enmeshed in different dimensions of conservation, in sustainable use, and in conflict. But going back to some of Herzog's work that I mentioned at the beginning, a critical issue that could be unpacked further are the terms gender difference and sex difference. In some sections of the research community, there's an argument that gender difference results from socialization, whereas sex difference is more innate. In reality, however, factors responsible for male-female differences defy simplistic nature-culture, nature-nurture dichotomies. And as we know, behavioral and cognitive differences between males and females are the result of numerous forces that interact in complex ways. Keeping that aside, in terms of pragmatic action, there are a few things that perhaps we can focus on as a result, and at least as a start to ensure gender equitability and justice. The first would be to mainstream gender in these fields and to bring marginalized voices to the forefront. Typically, these are of women, but occasionally men too are left out of the picture. The first, we have increasing gender representation within conservation, particularly as far as conservation biologists and conservation activists are concerned. But rural women's contributions to conservation are often ignored or unrecognized and often devalued and uncompensated. Very few women from these systems find a place in decision-making contexts, and this needs to be improved. A number of campaigns have taken cognizance of these issues, and there are formal campaigns in the offing, like what you see here on the screen. But whatever the challenges is, we need to find a voice for at least almost a half of humanity whose voices are often ignored.